Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. We're diving back into the American Civil War today. I've been thinking a lot about the American Civil War this week because I started a new podcast. It kind of goes in conjunction with my YouTube channel that I have kind of on the side called Stories of the Civil War, and the podcast is called Stories of the Civil War. The first episode went live a couple of days ago, and it's already about to break into the top 100 history podcasts on Apple Podcasts after just one episode, which is amazing, and I appreciate all of you who have already been listening to it. The first episode was about one of my favorite people in the American Civil War. His name was John Logan. He commanded the division that the 20th Ohio was a part of, which I'm writing a book about right now, and he's one of the colonels in command of a regiment at the battle we're going to talk about today, which is the Battle of Belmont. So if you're interested in the American Civil War and you like podcasts, I put the link in the description of this video to both of my podcasts, Stories of the Civil War and Stories of the Great War. Stories of the Great War has like 6 episodes. Stories of the Civil War, the second episode's going live today. It's about Richard Kirkland, a Confederate soldier known as the Angel of Marie's Heights. Really excited about how that one turned out, so check that out later today if you would. The link will take you to Podbean, which is where I host the podcast, but you can listen to it on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, anywhere you listen to podcasts. So today we're going to go to the channel Warhawk, who does these really in-depth looks at Civil War battles on kind of a regimental level, which is really cool. So I'll put the link in the description to that as well. And we're going to take a look at the first time that Ulysses S. Grant commands troops in battle during the American Civil War. It's in November of 1861. This is when there's not a lot of fighting going on, especially in the Western Theater. Not much has happened so far, but a lot of the people involved in this battle are going to become major players later. Like I said, John Logan. You're going to have John McClernand there leading a brigade. You're going to have a guy like W.H.L. Wallace, who's a colonel at this battle, but will be a division commander by the time he gets to Shiloh. So important first steps for what will eventually become the Army of the Tennessee, the main operating army in the Western Theater, or one of the main armies, along with the armies of the Ohio and the Cumberland. So this will be an interesting look at what on the surface wasn't a real consequential battle, but had ramifications that lasted long afterwards. Let's dive in. That's got to be a Grant quote, yeah. Let's just take that quote in for a second. This is September of 1861. This is in the aftermath of the Battle of Bull Run. Nobody's really doing anything. And here's Grant, who at this point has just been elevated to brigadier general. He originally wasn't even going to be a part of the war, but he gets command of an Illinois regiment, and he whips them into shape so well that it impresses some higher ups, and he's got some political connections through Congressman Washburn that get him this appointment to this small little department down around Cairo, Illinois. And he is already wanting to fight. He knows they need to take it to the enemy, and nobody wants to do it. And he's trying to convince guys like Fremont and Halleck, let me fight, and nobody wants to fight.
By the early fall of 1861, the Union Army's Western Department under Major General John C. Fremont is still reeling from the crushing defeat of Brigadier General Nathaniel Lyon's Army of the West at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August. With his department's headquarters located in St. Louis, Missouri, Major General Fremont aches to strike back at Brigadier General Sterling Price's pro-Southern Missouri State Guard.
And so Fremont is a well-known guy at this point. He is the first Republican nominee for president of the United States in 1856. He had some exploits before that made him kind of a household name for a lot of people.
However, the threat posed by Confederate forces in southeastern Missouri under Major Generals Leonidas Polk, William J. Hardee, and Brigadier General Gideon J. Pillow.
So let's talk about all three of these guys for a second. Leonidas Polk is he had originally gone to West Point, but he drops out to go to seminary and becomes an Episcopal bishop. Hardee is the author of the kind of the field tactics manual for the U.S. Army at this point. And Pillow had just been the Secretary of War under James Buchanan and had a very inflated sense of his own importance. And he's going to be the guy in command at Fort Donelson, but he's going to skip out because when he was Secretary of War, and he kind of knew that the war was coming. He started diverting resources into southern forts so they'd be easier to confiscate when southern states started seceding.
Hold him back from launching any major offensive action. Over the summer, Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant, a rising star officer in the Western Department, had won Fremont's confidence with minor displays of competence and energy. And so, on
the low was pretty bar. Minor displays of competence and energy. The bar's pretty low. I love this picture of Grant. It's not one you often see, and that's the one when he is kind of newly a brigadier general. His beard's a little longer, and he's got, he's looking a little more fancy there. You don't see much of that from Grant later on in the war.
August 28th, General Fremont appointed Grant to command of the District of Southeast Missouri. Fremont posted General Grant at Cairo, Illinois, and defined his mission. Clear southeast.
So it looks like it's spelled Cairo, but it is indeed spelled Cairo or Cairo. This is where the Mississippi and Ohio rivers come together. It's very low and was prone to flooding, and never really took off as a major city, even though it had that really prime location, and that's because of the flooding and mosquitoes, and it was just kind of a nasty place to live.
East Missouri of rebel forces and occupy Columbus, Kentucky. Grant's mission seems much easier when Generals Pellow and Hardee abandoned southeast Missouri in September. Still, the dominant terrain feature of the area is a great swamp, 5 to 25 miles wide, extending from the Arkansas borderline northward to a point parallel with Cape Girardeau.
So, a couple things about this area here. First of all, Kentucky is kind of like, you don't go there because they were officially neutral, and both sides were trying to avoid entering Kentucky with troops, even though it eventually gets violated. New Madrid is where you had the devastating earthquake that hit about 50 years earlier. And so the operations for Grant are really going to have to be confined to southeast Missouri because they can't really enter Kentucky just yet.
This marshy terrain offers shelter for the Swamp Fox, Brigadier General M. Jeff Thompson, and his mobile band of Missouri State Guard partisans, allowing them to move about southeastern Missouri with impunity. General Thompson evades determined pursuits but seeks fights and conducts raids with a frequency embarrassing the Union Army and demoralizing Northern sympathizers. Indeed, Thomas possesses a combination of sense and bombast, of military shrewdness and personal buffoonery. Missouri is a very wild place during the war. You're dealing with a lot of, like, Eastern Kentucky is very similar. You're dealing with a lot of, like, small units that are very difficult to track down. You're not dealing with big armies fighting each other. You have moments where they did, like at Wilson's Creek. General Thompson was a thorn that continually pricked or threatened to prick the sensitive Union flank, and he appeared to be covering Confederate detachments towards General Price. Fremont believes to the point of paranoia that Price, Thompson, and Polk are all working in concert. Thus, it becomes elemental to Fremont's Missouri strategy to cut communications between Columbus, Kentucky, and Sterling Price. The possession of the little steamboat landing at Belmont, Missouri, would assure this. At the Battle of Fredericktown on October 21st, the same day that the Battle of Ball's Bluff is raging in Virginia, Grant manages to bloody General Thompson's nose by dispatching units from Cape Girardeau and Bird's Point after the Swamp Fox, keeping him on the run. It was during this small skirmish engagement that a 1,500-man federal detachment from the 11th Missouri and the 20th Illinois under Colonel Joseph Plummer, a veteran regular Army officer who had been wounded in Ray's cornfield at Wilson's Creek, manages to consolidate control over southeastern Missouri. In September, the national spotlight in the West shifts from Missouri to the divided and precariously neutral state of Kentucky. Both sides have been recruiting men and organizing regiments openly in the self-proclaimed neutral border state.
So the viewpoint here is we can recruit men, but we're not going to enter Kentucky with an army. And of course that gets violated, at least from what we can see, first by the Confederates, and then the second Grant gets word that the Confederate troops have entered Kentucky, he goes in himself.
But they are doing so in a fashion as to not alienate Kentucky's divided population. However, the August 1861 elections bring in a Unionist legislature to Kentucky thanks to a boycott by secessionists.
And Kentucky kind of has this shadow government where they have like a Confederate version of everything. So they have a Confederate governor and there's a Union governor, and it's a mess.
Marks the beginning of the end of neutrality in Kentucky. On September 3, 1861, Major General Polk violates Kentucky's neutrality by ordering Brigadier General Pillow to occupy the city of Columbus. Kentucky was now caught in the midst of the conflict that it had tried so hard to avoid becoming involved in. With Confederate forces invading the Commonwealth, Kentucky is now at the forefront of the Civil War's Western theater. Brigadier General Grant arrives in Cairo, Illinois, to take command of the new district the day that Columbus falls to the rebels. Immediately, Grant begins proposing a countermove, which General Fremont approves.
So the way it works, especially early in the war, is that you have departments. And so you have the department that Grant is in command in, which is part of a larger department that is commanded by Fremont. And then with all of these Western departments, then they answer to Halleck eventually. And so within these departments, you have soldiers who are assigned to those departments. And they're going to become eventually the armies of those departments. And so the Department of the Ohio, which I think was initially commanded by McClellan, but then is later commanded by Don Carlos Buell, is going to include troops that are going to form the Army of the Ohio. The Department of the Tennessee, named after the Tennessee River, becomes the Army of the Tennessee eventually.
Gathering 2 regiments and steaming up the Ohio River, Grant seizes Paducah, Kentucky on September 6. It is a magnificent show of offensive initiative on Grant's part. Although Generals Polk and Pillow organize a belated attempt to drive Grant from Paducah, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston arrives to assume command of the newly formed Army of Central Kentucky. Johnston then aborts the plan to retake.
They've gone from we're neutral to now we have a department that is named. We have the Army of Central Kentucky, and Albert Sidney Johnston is the highest-ranking Confederate officer in the field anywhere in the country. He's outranked, I believe, only by Samuel Cooper, who never takes a field command. He's a 4-star general. He's going to be, of course, killed at the Battle of Shiloh. And Johnston was one of the few on either side who had been a general before the war. Him and Joe Johnston, I think, might have been among the only prominent officers that we really talk much about who had been a general before the war. He'd been a general all the way back in Texas after the Texas Revolution.
Take Paducah, instead ordering Polk and Pillow to begin fortifying Columbus in order to block the Mississippi River. General Grant presses Fremont to allow him to launch a raid against the Confederate forces downriver from Cairo, but is ignored. As October passes with no major action against the Confederates in southeastern Missouri or Kentucky, Major General Fremont's position begins to grow more precarious. Finally, President Lincoln withdraws his support of Fremont and decides to relieve him. This change of command will give Grant opportunity to finally take the fight to the Confederacy. This would be the first true test of Ulysses S. Grant's command leadership in battle during the Civil War.
And we should mention that there are a lot of reasons why Fremont gets replaced, not the least of which was the fact that Fremont basically set himself up as like his own little empire out west, where he thought he could just kind of do whatever he wanted and issue whatever kind of orders he wanted with no real accountability to Washington. And that only went so far.
Grant's expeditionary command for the raid on Belmont numbers 3,114 men and officers, and is organized into 2 brigades. One, based in Cairo, is led by Brigadier General John A. McClernand, an Illinois political general with connections and friends in high places.
And among his friends are Lincoln himself. McClernand is an Illinois congressman who is well connected, and that's why he lasts as long as he does, and eventually he'll get replaced, thankfully, by Grant during the siege of Vicksburg for repeatedly disobeying orders and just being a general pain in the butt, who was always scheming, and he was not particularly good. 27th Illinois, I believe, is the one that's commanded by Napoleon Bonaparte Buford, who's the brother of John Buford of Gettysburg fame. 31st Illinois is known as the Dirty First and is commanded by John Logan, who will probably end up being the best political general on either side during the war.
The other, headquartered at Bird's Point, is commanded by Colonel Henry Dougherty. 2 cavalry companies and an artillery battery are also attached to Grant's expedition. Bright sunshine greets Grant's men on Wednesday morning, November 6th. The camps at Cairo and Bird's Point come alive early with feverish activity as the regiments pack knapsacks, cook rations, clean and reclean weapons, and undergo careful inspections.
So, really important glimpse of what's going to become a huge part of Grant's success in the West is his coordination with the Navy. It was really important to have gunboats available, to have these steamers available that you could load troops onto, and a lot of the movement's going to happen by way of transporting troops with the Navy on rivers like the Tennessee and the Ohio and the Cumberland and the Mississippi.
Colonel Francis B. Folk's 30th Illinois and Colonel John A. Blackjack Logan's 31st Illinois marched down to the Cairo levee at about 3 p.m. that afternoon and began filling over the stage planks onto the transport boat Alex Scott, the largest of the private steamers Grant has under contract. Colonel Napoleon B. Buford's 27th Illinois, the 3rd Regiment in McClernand's Cairo Brigade, embarks on the James Montgomery. Captain James J. Dolan's Independent Company of Illinois Cavalry board either the Rob Roy or the Chancellor. Most of Grant's wagons are placed aboard the Keystone State. Before they embark, however, McClernand sends a telegram to his friend, Major General George B. McClellan of the Army of the Potomac, alerting him to the expedition. At about dusk...
See, right off the bat, that's not your place, McClernand, to be sending a telegram to your superior back in Washington of what your plans are. There's a level of command here, and you've just skipped over about 3 levels of it.
The fleet departs Cairo and steams across the river to Bird's Point on the Missouri shore, where Grant's large and luxurious Belle Memphis takes aboard Colonel Henry Dougherty's 22nd Illinois, while Colonel Jacob Lawman's 7th Iowa joins Buford's men on the Montgomery. Also boarding steamers at Bird's Point are Colonel Ezra Taylor's 6-gun Chicago Light Battery and Delano's Adams County Cavalry Company from Illinois.
So one of the things I love is that we know exactly which steamers these guys were on, and it might seem weird that we know that kind of detail, but we do. In my work on writing the story of Company H of the 20th Ohio, we have the same details. I know exactly which ships they were on at different times, depending on where they were going.
Commanded by Lieutenant James K. Catlin. All is ready and the sun is setting when Brigadier General Grant comes aboard the Belle Memphis. Soon after dark, Grant signals to Union Navy Commander Henry A. Walk aboard the USS Tyler that the embarkation is complete. Walk eases the gunboat Tyler into the main channel, closely followed by the gunboat USS Lexington.
What's cool about this, too, is the Lexington and the Tyler are the same 2 gunboats that are going to be present at Shiloh in April of 1862, helping defend Grant's left flank at Pittsburgh Landing.
Keystone State pulls into line behind the gunboats, beginning the grand procession of transport steamers. Some delays occur when the Chancellor goes aground, but the expeditionary fleet is finally underway again at about 9 p.m.
There are these little sandbars and stuff that are really tricky to navigate at times on rivers, and you hear him talking about the one going aground. Because this is in the South now, I mean, you're starting into the South, and even Southern Illinois was very pro-slavery and didn't have a lot of sympathies toward the North at this point. They didn't have a lot of experienced captains who knew these areas of the rivers because they had all signed on with the Confederacy.
At first, none of the Union troops knew where they were heading, but the word soon spread across the fleet that their destination was Columbus. The men were then briefed on their mission. The Federals would attack a Confederate camp known as Camp Johnston. across the river from Columbus at Belmont, Missouri. Throughout the pre-dawn hours of November 7, 1861, Grant's Expeditionary Command is transported downriver towards Columbus and Belmont. At about 8 a.m., the first transport ties up on the Missouri shore, 3 miles north of Belmont. Commander Walk's gunboats hover out in the main channel providing cover. The pilot of the Belle Memphis, Charles Scott, chooses a site called Hunter's Farm, a small steamboat landing close to the end of Lucas Bend, just out of sight. Though not out of range of the Columbus batteries, the formidable Confederate artillery batteries posted on the bluffs of Columbus include 10-inch Columbiads and 11-inch howitzers. However, the most dangerous gun in the Columbus battery is the massive Lady Polk, a 128-pounder Whitworth rifle, the largest gun in the Confederacy. By 8:30 a.m., the Federal...
So yeah, you don't want to land right at Columbus in that case. You've got to find somewhere else to go. And this is going to be the same strategy that will be used during the Vicksburg campaign, is avoid the big batteries on the river, try and find a way around them.
Infantry is ashore. Their officers soon form them into ranks in a clearing in front of a cornfield. Behind them, the soldiers can hear the Chicago Light Battery still coming ashore. Brigadier General Grant begins marching his infantry regiment south down a single wooded road toward Belmont. Union columns push on, clearing wooded thickets and fallen timbers, forming an abattis in their path. Up ahead, Grant's independent cavalry companies, leading the march, skirmish with rebel pickets in the woods. Consulting with Brigadier General McClernand, Grant begins forming his attack plan as they near the Confederate camp. The 5 infantry regiments go into line of battle, with Dougherty's brigade on the left and McClernand's on the right. Once the Cairo Brigade is deployed into line, McClernand orders forward 2 companies from each of his regiments as skirmishers at 10 a.m. Spearheading McClernand's probing action on the far right is a platoon of Captain William A. Schmidt's Company A, 27th Illinois. This is Colonel Buford's flank company under his best company commander. Colonel Logan also puts forward his 31st Illinois 2 flank companies, A and K, under the experienced command of indispensable Lieutenant Colonel John H. White. On the left side of the Union line is Colonel Dougherty's Bird Point Brigade, consisting of Colonel Lawman's 7th Iowa and Lieutenant Colonel Harrison E. Hart's 22nd Illinois.
So you notice Illinois and Iowa guys for the most part, and this is going to be the case throughout the war in what was then called the Western Theater. You're going to have a lot of Illinois units, a lot of Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota units. And some of those are going to be mixed. I mean, you're going to have Ohio units and Illinois units in the Eastern Theater as well, and Iowa and Minnesota, but most of the units for those states are going to fight out west.
The 7th Iowa, already diminished by the assignment of 2 companies to guard the boat landing, pushes out a heavy skirmish contingent of 3 companies. Grant himself is posted on the left with Dougherty's brigade. Along Grant's front, which runs about half a mile down the Bird Point Road, companies of infantry skirmishers move forward across the slough and into the labyrinth of wild wood. For a while, these men try moving at the double-quick pace, then begin to slow as the big trees and undergrowth saps their strength and disorders their lines.
And remember, these are volunteer soldiers. Most of them have not really seen much combat so far, if any at all. They've certainly not been in any major action. This is going to be the first one. And so a lot of this is a learning experience for everybody involved.
As they progress, the men can hear drums in the distance, the long roll coming from the rebel camp. The advance becomes cautious. To the rear of the skirmish line, back at Bird's Point Road, the main body of infantry and artillery continues to wait and grows restless. These men with bright new uniforms and outdated weapons strain to hear sounds that will tell them what is going on. It is alarmingly quiet in the woods across the slough. Suddenly, Captain Schmidt's lead platoon on the extreme right of Buford's 27th Illinois encounters Confederate cavalry on the right, about 100 yards beyond the slough, and draw fire. They return the fire, easily driving off the rebel horsemen, and continue on. After the initial contact, Buford stiffens and extends Captain Schmidt's line by sending up the remainder of Company A. Still not satisfied with the number of troops forward, Buford now orders his entire regiment over the slough and in general support of Schmidt. After an advance of another 200 yards, Schmidt's company is struck again.
And the whole purpose of skirmishers, of course, is to probe and figure out where the enemy is, but it allows your main body time to maneuver and to get into position and to figure out exactly how you want to do things while you buy yourself a little bit of time to figure all that out.
This time by fire from a larger body of cavalry. One man falls wounded. Schmidt holds his ground and forms his Company A into line. He then concentrates his men's fire and soon drives off the enemy. Colonel Buford had heard enough. He orders the 27th Illinois forward at the double quick. Dismounting from his horse, Colonel Buford personally leads the regiment, pushing forward companies ahead rapidly but cautioning against becoming scattered and detached from the main body.
And listen, if you're Buford and you have a name like Napoleon Bonaparte Buford, you darn well better be a good soldier. That's all I'm saying.
Soon, Buford's men begin to see small groups of Confederate infantry in the thickets to their front and right. They exchange shots, and the Confederates quickly retire. Realizing Buford's 27th Illinois had developed the enemy to his right, General McClernand begins pushing his other regiments forward in an attempt to maintain the original brigade alignment. It is at this point that the call goes back down Bird's Point Road to bring up Taylor's Chicago Battery, with McClernand ordering a section of the battery to protect the road. As the Union advance continues through the thickets and woods, the Confederates steadily give way before the Federal attack. By 11 a.m., all Confederate skirmishers have been driven back to their main line of battle. Close behind in pursuit are the lead elements of the 30th and 31st Illinois. As he nears the Confederate position, Colonel Logan folds his 3 skirmisher companies back into his line of battle and gives Lieutenant Colonel White command of the companies on the left flank. The regiment then advances, with White's battalion striking the left of the 12th Tennessee, the 13th Arkansas, and the right of the 22nd Tennessee. Lieutenant Colonel Tyree H. Bell's Confederates of the 12th Tennessee return fire, and after a time, White withdraws his battalion with casualties. Simultaneously, Logan's right wing comes under heavy fire from Colonel James C. Tampin's troops of the 13th Arkansas. 2 company commanders from the 31st Illinois quickly go down, and Logan's horse is shot from under him with a...
and this is the first of many times that Logan's going to be right in the line of fire. He was not a guy who was afraid to be near the front. Gets his horse shot out from him here. He's going to take 2 bullets at the Battle of Fort Donelson, and is just always going to be right there in the thick of things and inspiring and leading his men. But at this early stage of the war, you lose a couple of company commanders, you lose a couple of important officers at key places, and command and control is going to become very difficult because these men are needing that leadership. They're going to be needing that inspiration, or else they're going to break pretty quickly.
Musket ball shattering the pistol hanging from his hip. Logan commands his troops to drop to their stomachs and shoot from the ground.
Smart.
Most of the shots from the 31st, however, are unaimed, just volume fire at an enemy 200-300 yards away, hidden by intervening trees. Recognizing this, General Grant orders Logan to have his regiment cease fire to conserve ammunition. Logan's position on the left flank of Grant's line is in danger from both the 13th Arkansas and the heavy fire from the 12th Tennessee beyond Logan's left.
And speaking of Grant, I don't know exactly how close to the front lines Grant is. It's a small force, obviously, and so it's not going to be like later in the war where he's going to be far behind because he's going to be at headquarters. But everyone who knew Grant described him as seemingly gaining focus under combat. It was like combat kind of made him better. You know, some people crack, some people get nervous, some people get frustrated. Grant seemed to improve in those conditions.
McClernand corrects the situation with dispatch, moving the 31st Illinois to the left. He also orders up a section of the Chicago Battery to support Logan's movement and places it under the colonel's command. Fortunately for Colonel Logan, the 12th Tennessee is beginning to run short on ammunition. The Tennessee troops fix bayonets and charge into the waiting muskets of Logan's regiment. The 13th Arkansas soon joins in the charge.
And you might think, well, man, how do they run out of ammo so fast? Well, think about this. I mean, typically they might carry 40, maybe 60 rounds, but typically 40. And if you can fire 2 or 3 rounds a minute, you're out of ammo in 20 minutes. That's not very long. I mean, if you're firing continually. A lot of these battles, the bigger battles, especially like Gettysburg, things like that, they're going to be firing hundreds of rounds because they're going to be constantly being resupplied while they're fighting.
It is also repulsed by Blackjack Logan's troops. Meanwhile, in the center of Grant's battle lines, the 7th Iowa and the 30th Illinois press the attack on the 21st and 22nd Tennessee. On Grant's right, the 22nd Illinois continue pushing back the 13th Tennessee. All the while, Colonel Buford's 27th Illinois and Dolan's cavalry company are moving along a road to the Confederates' left.
If you're the Confederates here, your back is up against the river. You don't have the boats that are right there to immediately load onto and get out of Dodge, so to speak. So you're starting to think, okay, what do we do now?
And strike them from the woods in their exposed flank. As the 27th Illinois begins its attack on the Confederate left flank, Colonel Logan's 31st Illinois also moves into a position to attack the Confederates' right. Grant's attack plan is now turning into a double envelopment pincer of the rebel lines. After hours of close quarters musket fighting, the rebel lines in the fields beyond Belmont are beginning to break. Grant's pincer movement was playing out perfectly as the 27th and 31st Illinois attacked from the flanks while the rest of McClernand and Dougherty's brigades pressed the center. At 2 p.m., the fighting quickly becomes one-sided as General Pillow's line of battle begins to collapse and withdraw toward Camp Johnston. The orderly retreat soon turns into a panicked rout as Federal batteries open fire on the retreating Confederates.
That's a great quote right there. At this point, they became demoralized from their victory and failed to reap its full reward. And again, remember, we're dealing with soldiers who are new to combat. You've just won a victory after not really ever experiencing anything like this before. And command and control breaks down.
Around 2:30, the Confederates abandoned their colors and artillery before running towards the river in their attempt to escape. Grant is constantly at the front of his battle lines, personally leading his men in the field. By 3 p.m., Camp Johnston has fallen to the Federals. However, in the words of General Grant, his soldiers were demoralized by their own victory and began freely looting the rebel camp.
And we're going to see a similar thing happen with Confederate troops when they overrun the camps at Shiloh on the early morning of the first day of the Battle of Shiloh. They're going to get to the camps of units like, I think, the 25th Missouri, and they're going to start looting the camp. And it's going to take them an hour or more to get the men back into line and to be able to continue the fight.
Several minutes for Grant and his officers to restore order to the ranks, and he orders the camp and its supplies burned to finally return stability to the men. However, when the Federals burned Camp Johnston, they failed to notice several wounded Confederates still trapped inside numerous tents, and the crippled soldiers burned to death. Although this is an accident, the retreating Confederates believe that this is intentional murder of prisoners and become outraged. As the Union troops begin to march back to their transports between 3:30 and 4 p.m., taking with them 2 captured guns and 106 Confederate prisoners, they are suddenly attacked by rebel reinforcements brought over from Columbus on the transport boats Prince and Charm. These troops soon threaten to cut off Grant's line of retreat. The Southerners are troops of the 15th Tennessee, the 11th Louisiana, and various mixed infantry units under General Pillow and Colonel Benjamin F. Cheatham. By this time, Major General Polk has also crossed the Mississippi River from Columbus and was taking charge of the Confederate lines. To make matters worse for Grant and his men, Lady Polk unleashes a salvo of shells from Columbus towards their position. The fire from Lady Polk is soon joined by the other Confederate batteries in the town. The Union gunboats under Commander Walk soon exchange fire with the Confederate batteries in Columbus. Grant orders his men to begin forcing their way through the rebel lines back towards the transports. Suddenly, remembering the 7th Iowa Detachment he had left to guard the escape route further back, Grant gallops back in search of his men, only to find Confederate soldiers moving in his direction.
There's a couple moments during this battle that Grant could have been taken out, and the whole trajectory of the Union cause might change.
7th Iowa Detachment had actually returned to the boats after learning of the Confederate river crossing and the success of Grant's raid. Spinning his horse around and racing for the river, Grant notices that the riverboat captains have already ordered the mooring lines cast off.
This is one of these moments where you see Grant's skill as a horseman. He, all the way back to childhood, had been known as a fantastic horseman, and I'm sure he's going to talk about what happens.
An impressive display of his equestrian abilities, General Grant manages to gallop across the gangplank of the Belle Memphis as his troops cheer him on.
He rides his horse on this narrow, like, I would have been afraid of falling off, but it's one of those moments that, like, I so wish that they would make a TV miniseries about Grant, because there's moments like this throughout his life.
As the last man to board the transports, Grant orders the riverboats to begin sailing back up the Mississippi toward Cairo. By 5 p.m., Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant's first battle is over. The Union had lost 607 men. The Confederates around 641.
And there's a moment when Grant sits down on a couch on the boat that he's a part of, and he gets called up to talk, I think, to the captain or one of the officers. And he gets up, and as he's walking away, a stray bullet flies into the boat and hits the exact spot where his head had been a few minutes earlier.
The battle is technically inconclusive, although the Union forces under General Grant were successful in capturing and destroying Camp Johnston and taking with them 100 prisoners. The counterattack by the Confederates threw Grant's men into disarray. Both sides claimed victory for the battle. However, the Battle of Belmont proves to be a crucial first step in Grant's Civil War career.
And it's a learning experience for all of these guys, but especially for Grant. So this is Grant learning about how to be successful, but also about keeping your men in line, because, of course, you have the counterattack. It's going to cause him to be a little bit more vigilant, though he's going to get surprised at Shiloh. But this is an important first step toward what will become the nucleus of the Army of the Tennessee for Grant. So let me know your thoughts about all of that. Please definitely check out Stories of the Civil War, both the YouTube channel, but also the new podcast if you're into that sort of thing. Thanks for watching.